He walked away from 30 years of routine and thought he'd left everything behind. Until he met the woman who never planned to stay, but somehow never truly left. She didn't arrive with answers, just two small children and a quiet sadness, and he didn't offer promises, only a place to rest and maybe begin again. They spoke more with actions than words, with fixed gates, shared breakfasts, and evenings spent under trees rather than roofs, and without meaning to, they stitched something back together. But some pasts don't stay buried, and when the peace they built was threatened, he didn't hesitate, because love, when it comes late, comes strong. From a field where two broken paths crossed, something began to grow. Not fast, not loud, but real. If stories like this find a quiet place in your heart, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and let's keep walking toward the kind of love that takes root one day at a time. It had been raining for hours, not the kind of rain that passed quickly, light and polite. This one clung to the earth, to the bones, to the soul. Jack's wipers slapped back and forth, trying to keep up with the sheets of water pounding the windshield. The narrow road ahead was nothing but mud and shadow, carved through golden fields now dulled to ash under the storm. Jack hadn't meant to be out this late, but after 30 years of doing what was expected, what was routine, he was still learning what to do with an empty schedule. He had quit the mill just 10 days ago, a final quiet goodbye to a life that had taken his youth and left him with sore joints, a weathered heart, and a house too quiet for its creaking walls. He drove slowly, fingers loose on the steering wheel. The truck's old heater coughed, blowing half-hearted warmth. A coffee cup rattled in the holder. The road curved. That's when he saw them. A stalled SUV sat crooked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat on its last breath. Through the rain-drenched glass, Jack could make out a figure in the driver's seat. No, two, no, three. A woman. Children. He drove past, just a little, then stopped. For a moment, the only sound was rain hitting metal, his own breath heavy inside the cab. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred. Not the hands of a man who rescued strangers anymore. He'd buried that instinct with his wife years ago, buried it with the idea that people could still surprise him. But something made him reverse. He rolled down the window just enough to speak. "You all right?" he called, voice firm but not unkind. The woman opened her door slowly. Rain hit her like it had been waiting. Her hair was soaked, cheeks flushed from cold. Her coat clung to her, too thin for the season. Behind her, a girl around 6 clutched a stuffed rabbit, and a younger boy pressed his forehead to the fogged window, eyes wide and glassy. "We're fine," the woman said, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Jack hesitated, then got out. Mud sucked at his boots. The wind bit through his flannel shirt as he approached. She didn't flinch, but she looked like someone who used to. "Engine?" he asked. "Dead," she replied. "I tried calling for help, but there's no signal out here. Nearest town's 15 miles, he said. "Nothing out this way, but silence." She nodded, almost ashamed. Rain ran down her jawline like it belonged there. Jack looked at the kids again. The girl was trying not to cry. "I've got a place not far," he said. "Old farm. You can wait out the storm there." The woman hesitated. "I'm not offering the Ritz," Jack added. "Just dry walls and a roof." Still, she didn't speak, but the little girl whispered, "Mama, I'm cold." That was enough. "Grab what you need," Jack said, already turning back toward his truck. They followed without another word. The drive was quiet. Jack could hear their shivers, could feel the weight of her silence in the cab. She kept one hand on each child. Protective. Guarded. She didn't offer her name, and he didn't ask. The farm appeared through the curtain of rain. 2 sagging barns, a windmill long retired, and a farmhouse tucked against a hill. Most of the place was a ghost now, except for the lights Jack had left on in the mudroom and the old tool shed out back. He parked near the shed. "You'll be warmer in there than the house," he said, nodding toward the small structure. I haven't had anyone inside the main place in years." She didn't question it, just lifted the boy into her arms and reached for the girl's hand. Jack opened the shed door and flicked on a low bulb. The space smelled of hay, old cedar, and time. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and it was safe. Jack stepped inside, pulled a folded quilt off a storage trunk and laid it across a weather-worn bench. "It's clean," he said gently. "Warmer than nothing." She looked at the blanket as if it were a gift she wasn't sure she deserved, then nodded, barely. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice had a softness that didn't match the steel in her shoulders. Jack turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "There's water from the pump out back if you need it. I'll check in later." She didn't answer, but as he walked through the mud toward the farmhouse, he turned once and caught a glimpse of her kneeling, down to wrap the children in the quilt, her body curling around them like a shield. That night, the storm settled deeper over the valley. Thunder rolled like slow thoughts. Jack sat in his dark kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The wood floor creaked beneath his chair, the same way it always had. But tonight, it didn't echo the same. He looked out the window, toward the shed. A soft light still glowed from within, faint, flickering. And for the first time in a very long time, Jack Callahan felt something stir, something not quite hope, not quite fear, but real. A presence, a beginning. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story. But somehow, in the rain and silence, a door had opened, and this time he hadn't shut it. Jack didn't sleep much that night. Not because of the storm, it had softened after midnight, but because something about that quiet shed light tugged at the edges of his thoughts long after he'd crawled into bed. He lay still, the old quilt pulled up to his chest, listening to the wind scratch against the window pane like a memory trying to get in. He hadn't shared this property with another soul in years. Not since Anna passed. Not since Maisie had gone off to college and the house had grown too quiet, too big, too full of echoes. It had been easier to let things close in, to shrink his world down to the workshop and the porch and the radio and the things he could fix with his hands. People? People weren't tools. They broke in ways that didn't make sense. And when they left a silence you couldn't hammer or glue back together. He rose early, before the sun had fully claimed the field. The rain had stopped. The sky, outside the window, was pale and bruised like it had stayed up all night worrying. Jack rubbed his face, groaned at the creak in his back, and headed down the narrow staircase. In the kitchen, the coffee pot hissed like an old friend clearing its throat. He poured a cup, then stood at the sink watching the shed. No smoke, no movement. Maybe they'd left in the night. Maybe that was best. But something inside him, something too stubborn to name, told him they were still there. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a second mug, and stepped out into the damp morning. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and dying leaves. His boots left prints in the soft mud. When he opened the shed door, he found her exactly where he'd left her, curled on the floor with her children, the quilt draped over all, three like a shelter. She looked up, blinking slowly, hair tangled across her cheek. The boy was still asleep, tucked against her chest. The girl sat cross-legged beside her, hugging the stuffed rabbit to her ribs. "I brought coffee." "Jack," said, raising the mug. She hesitated, then sat up straighter and nodded. He passed it to her carefully, avoiding her eyes. His fingers brushed hers, cold, trembling, smaller than he expected. "Thank you," she murmured again. He noticed how she didn't drink right away, how she held the cup like it might vanish if she gripped it too tight. "You warm enough?" he asked, nodding to the quilt. "It helped," she said softly. Jack glanced around. The shed was dry, but it wasn't meant for living. There was a faint draft from the cracked panel above the door. The floorboards were uneven. And the kids, they deserved more than this. He cleared his throat. "There's a room inside," he said, surprising even himself. "Hasn't been used in a while, but it's clean and warm." She looked at him, really looked. Her eyes were a storm, gray-green, watchful, like someone who'd learned to read danger before it spoke. "You don't have to," she said quietly. This was more than enough. "I know," Jack replied, "but you've got kids, and it's going to be colder tonight." She hesitated. He could see it, could feel the battle behind her stillness, pride and fear, weighing everything. Finally, she nodded. Okay. The farmhouse door hadn't been opened to guests in over 6 years. The hallway still smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. Jack flicked on the living room lamp. It buzzed to life, casting soft gold against the paneled walls. Dust danced in the light like small truths. He led them upstairs to the room at the end of the hall. It had once been Maisie's. The twin bed was still there, the quilt still folded at the end. A bookshelf full of forgotten paperbacks stood beneath. "The window." "I'll leave you be," Jack said, clearing his throat. "Bathroom's across the hall. Water's hot if you give it a minute." She looked around, her eyes catching on the details. On the photos on the wall, the scuff marks. On the floor, the chair in the corner that wobbled slightly. "What's your name?" she asked finally, voice low. "Jack," she nodded once. "Elise." He didn't press further, didn't ask where she came from or what had led her to this rain-drenched stretch of nowhere. He just offered a short nod and stepped back toward the stairs. "Jack?" she called. After him, he paused. "Thank you." For the blanket. He turned slightly, his hand resting on the stair rail. His voice, when it came, was softer than he intended. "You looked like you needed someone to offer one." Then he went down, the echo of her footsteps lingering behind him longer than they should have. That night he sat by the fireplace in the living room, watching flames twist inside the old cast-iron stove. The house didn't feel empty, not quite. It didn't feel full either, just awake. He glanced at the staircase. Somewhere up there, a woman he didn't know was helping her children brush their teeth with borrowed towels, tucking them into a stranger's bed, listening for sounds that might mean danger. And here he was, in the same chair where he'd once read bedtime stories, where he'd once fallen asleep with a toddler on his chest, wondering why the silence felt heavier now that it was shared. He sipped his coffee. It tasted different tonight, like something was shifting. And maybe it was. Maybe the blanket he'd almost kept folded had done more than cover a stranger in the dark. Maybe, just maybe, it had loosened something inside him too. The next morning broke gray and quiet. The sky outside Jack's kitchen window was the color of wet stone, low clouds hugging the tops of the trees, the kind of morning that made everything feel still, like the world was holding its breath. Jack stood at the stove, watching the kettle rattle softly. He hadn't made breakfast for anyone but himself in years, and even that had become a ritual, more than a meal. He turned down the flame and poured hot water into a chipped mug. On the counter beside it, he'd placed another, steam curling from both cups in lazy spirals. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Elise entered the kitchen barefoot, sleeves pulled over her hands, her hair still damp from the upstairs bathroom. Jack noticed she'd taken one of Maisie's old sweaters from the hallway shelf, the blue one with frayed elbows and buttons shaped like daisies. It hung loose on her, but the color softened her somehow. "Morning," he said, sliding the mug toward her. She took it carefully, fingers barely brushing his. "Thank you." Her voice was always soft, he'd noticed, not timid, but careful, like someone who'd learned not to speak too loudly in case the world decided to bite back. The kids were still upstairs, asleep or pretending to be. Jack didn't press. He let the silence between them settle like dust, gentle and unspoken. He nodded toward the table. "Hungry?" She hesitated. "Just scrambled eggs and toast," he added, almost defensively. Her lips tugged upward just slightly. "Sounds good." He moved around the kitchen with practiced motions. Crack, whisk, salt, skillet. The sounds filled the space, the sizzle of butter, the soft tap of ceramic on wood. Elise sat quietly watching him, sipping tea like it was the first warm thing she'd held in weeks. There was no need for small talk. The quiet between them didn't feel empty. It felt like breath, like beginning again. When the food was ready, he set plates on the table, not making a show of it. She ate slowly, like she didn't quite trust it wasn't a dream. Jack didn't comment. He just kept eating, drinking his coffee, glancing out the window at the overcast sky. Eventually, the soft thump of feet on stairs broke the stillness. The children entered, sleep-rumpled and wide-eyed, holding hands. Elise stood quickly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "It's okay," Jack said gently, before she could say anything. "They're welcome." The little girl, Jack guessed she was 6, moved first. She climbed into a chair at the end of the table and stared at the plate Jack slid in front of her. Her brother followed, clutching a threadbare rabbit to his chest. "You like toast?" Jack asked him. The boy didn't answer, but Elise did, quiet but steady. "He does," Jack nodded, cutting a slice in half and spreading it with the last of the jam from the cellar. He slid it across the table. The boy looked at Elise, who nodded. He picked it up with both hands and took a small bite. And just like that, breakfast became a sort of truce. After the dishes were done, Elise insisted on washing. Jack led them through the house. "I figure you'll want more space than that bedroom," he said, pushing open the door to a room that hadn't seen light in years. Dust. Motes floated through the beams of sun filtering in from the high windows. It had once been Maisie's playroom. The shelves were still lined with books and wooden toys Jack had made by hand. A rocking chair sat near the window, draped in a faded quilt. The air smelled of cedar, old dreams, and something like lavender, soap from a decade ago. "I haven't touched much in here," he said. Elise didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the space like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. Jack watched her. How her hand lingered on the doorframe, how her fingers twitched when she saw the rocking chair. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a frozen lake, not sure whether to trust the ice. "I can clear it out," he offered quickly. "If it's too much." She shook her head. "No. It's..." She swallowed. "It's beautiful." Her voice caught on the last word. For a moment they stood in silence, the kind of silence that means something. Then she turned to him. "Why haven't you used this room?" He could have lied, could have said it was storage or that he just hadn't gotten around to it. But her eyes were asking the truth and he couldn't look away from them. "My daughter grew up in here," he said. "After my wife passed, it didn't feel right to take it apart." Elise nodded, like she understood exactly what he meant. Like she had rooms too. Quiet, closed, untouched. That evening, after the kids had fallen asleep curled together on the playroom rug, Elise found Jack in the barn, fixing a loose hinge on the stable door. "You have animals?" she asked, leaning in the doorway. "Used to," he replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Now it's just me and the barn cats." She stepped inside, arms wrapped around herself. "I can help," she said. "With cooking, cleaning, whatever you need." Jack straightened. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He looked at her then. Really looked. She was tired, still guarded, but there was something else in her eyes tonight. Something braver than yesterday. "All right," he said. "Deal." She smiled. Just barely. But it was real. That night, as Jack sat once again by the fire, he thought about how some doors didn't open with keys. They opened with need, with silence, with a blanket on a bench and toast spread with jam. He looked up at the stairs and listened. Laughter, light, distant, but real. And for the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like a memory. It felt like it was waking up. The nights were quieter now, but not silent. Sometimes Jack would hear the soft creak of floorboards above him, the rustle of Elise checking on the kids, or the faint clink of a mug placed carefully in the sink. The sounds no longer startled him. They folded into the fabric of the house like thread into an old quilt. The kind you pull over your shoulders without realizing it still smells like someone you loved. By the fourth night, Jack found himself staying up later than usual, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he didn't want to miss the way the house breathed again. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, after one requested a glass of water and the other insisted the closet door be checked twice, Jack stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, rich with the scent of leaves and distant wood smoke. A late autumn moon hung low over the fields, swollen and golden, casting everything in a soft silver hush. He wasn't surprised when he heard the door behind him creak. Elise stepped outside barefoot, her arms wrapped around her middle, her hair damp from the bath. She didn't speak, just sat down on the wooden steps beside him, knees pulled to her chest like she was trying to disappear into herself. Jack didn't ask why she was out here. He just offered her the tin mug in his hand. "It's weak," he said, "mostly chamomile, not much kick." She took it anyway, her hands brushing his again. They always seemed cold, her hands, even in warmth. They sat in silence for a long while. Crickets hummed in the distance. The porch light cast a gentle glow behind them. The moon glinted off the barn roof like a promise not yet fulfilled. Then softly, Elise spoke. "He used to tell me I was nothing without him." Jack didn't turn. He just listened. "He said I should be grateful, that no one else would put up with someone like me, that I'd ruin the kids if I ever left." Her voice didn't shake. It was too tired for trembling. It carried the flat, matter-of-fact cadence of someone who had repeated those words in her head long after she stopped believing them, but hadn't yet stopped hearing them. I believed him, for longer than I should have, even when the bruises stopped fading. Jack swallowed, the quiet around them tightening like a rope. "I tried to leave once," she said. "Took the kids, drove for hours, but I ran out of gas and nerve somewhere, in Kansas, and I went back. Told myself it was for their sake." She finally looked at Jack then. Her face was open but not exposed, like someone offering a photo from a time they don't talk about anymore. "But this time I didn't go back." Jack met her gaze. The porch light caught the shine in her eyes, but she didn't blink it away. "You did the hardest thing a person can do," he said, voice low. "You left what you knew. I didn't know if I had anywhere to go. You do now." Her lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, just once, as if accepting something bigger than a sentence. They sat that way for a while, the mug cooling in her hands, the night folding around them like a blanket. Later, back inside, Jack stood in the kitchen drying the last of the dinner plates. Elise had retreated upstairs to check on the kids. He could hear her soft steps overhead. He moved slowly, each motion deliberate. There was a calm in repetition, in washing and drying and putting away. It made the world manageable, predictable, but nothing felt predictable anymore, and that wasn't entirely unwelcome. He was placing the final glass on the shelf when he noticed something tucked beside the sink. A slip of paper, folded in half, as if left deliberately. Curious, he opened it, a note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for not asking too much and for not expecting too little." He read it twice, then tucked it gently into the side drawer near the stove, the one filled with old recipes and grocery lists, and now, something that might matter more than either. That night, he couldn't sleep. He wandered through the house, checking doors, windows, the thermostat. Not because he needed to, but because it gave him an excuse to linger. He stopped outside the playroom door. It was cracked open just slightly. He peeked in. The boy was curled up under the quilt Elise had brought down from the guest room. The little girl had kicked hers off in sleep, one socked foot hanging off the edge of the rug. Jack stepped inside, adjusted the blanket over her carefully. She stirred but didn't wake. As he turned to leave, he saw Elise sitting in the rocker by the window, nearly invisible in the moonlight. "You check on them too?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Old habit," he replied. "My daughter used to get cold at night, even in summer." She sounds lucky. I was the lucky one. They were quiet again, but it was a softer silence this time. One not held by fear, but by presence. He nodded toward the notebook in her lap. "You write a lot?" She looked down at it. Letters. For them. For later. He didn't ask what was in them. She didn't offer. And somehow, that was enough. In the hallway, outside the room as Jack reached the top of the stairs, he paused. The house felt different now. Not louder, not fuller, but alive. And in the quiet, in the moonlight on the floorboards, he realized something. It wasn't that Elise had started telling her story. It was that he had been willing, finally, to listen. And maybe that was how healing began, not with answers, but with space to speak. Some mornings came slowly, not with noise or urgency, but with soft clinks of dishes, the rustle of a quilt being pulled tighter, the distant giggle of children pretending not to be awake yet. Jack found himself rising before the sun most days, not because he needed to, but because the sound of life in his house again had become something he didn't want to miss. He wasn't sure when it had happened exactly, but the days had begun to stretch, not with obligation but with a kind of quiet fullness. Elise cooked now, sometimes just oatmeal or toast, but occasionally a casserole that made the whole house smell like something long remembered. She folded laundry with practiced care. The children started drawing on scrap paper from the old desk. In the den, stick figures, flowers, suns with too many rays. There were no grand conversations, no long declarations, but in the silences, something was being rebuilt. They didn't talk about plans. They didn't need to. On a Tuesday morning in mid-November, Jack returned from town with a bag of nails, a loaf of bread, and a jar of apple butter from Marla at the bakery. "Tell her she can call me if she ever gets tired of farm life," Marla had said with a wink. Elise only smiled when he passed the message along, her cheeks pink from the wind or something else. After lunch, Jack found the boy, Noah, sitting on the porch with a screwdriver and an old lantern. Jack had meant to fix it for years. He watched. From the doorway as Noah carefully twisted the screws loose, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. "Need a hand?" Jack asked, stepping outside. Noah looked up, then handed him the screwdriver without a word. The boy didn't speak much, but Jack didn't mind. Some people were just quiet. Some had been taught that silence was safer. Together, they took the lantern apart, piece by stubborn piece. Jack explained what each part did, not expecting response, just offering space. When they finally got the wick replaced and the chimney cleaned, Jack handed it back. "Want to light it?" Noah nodded. Just once. Jack struck a match. They watched the flame catch together. Inside, Elise watched them through the kitchen window, her hands still in dishwater, her lips pressed tight. Not with sadness, with something softer, something like breath held too long finally being released. Later that week, they cleared out the garden. The frost had killed what the deer hadn't taken. Jack handed Elise a pair of gloves and she followed, him into the rows of withered stalks and dead vines. They worked in silence, side by side, the rhythm of pulling and tossing and clearing like music only they could hear. At one point, she paused, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked. Jack straightened, the cold biting at his knees. "You mean this?" He gestured to the soil, to the house, to the quiet that surrounded them. She nodded. "All the time," he said. She didn't ask what had stopped him, and he didn't say. Because truthfully, he wasn't sure it had stopped. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Elise sat in the corner of the living room with her notebook open, the kids sprawled out beside her with coloring books Jack had found in the attic. The fire glowed low and steady. Jack worked on the old bookshelf, sanding down the edges, replacing 2 warped slats. It wasn't until later, after the children were asleep and Elise had gathered her things to go upstairs, that she paused at the base of the stairs. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting this be enough." Jack looked up from his chair. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, "but it doesn't feel like running anymore." He nodded. "It doesn't feel like hiding either." She lingered for a moment, then offered the faintest smile and climbed the stairs. The next morning, Jack found something new. Pinned to the fridge with a faded magnet was a crayon drawing, 4 stick figures, holding hands beneath a crooked tree. One was clearly Elise, long, hair a purple dress, 2 small ones beside her, and then him. A man with a cap and a crooked smile. He stared at it for a long time, then carefully moved it to the inside of the pantry door where he kept his tools, somewhere private, somewhere safe. They didn't say much, but they didn't need to. There was warmth in the way Elise left his coffee just the way he liked it, in the way Jack always checked the locks twice now, not from fear, but from care, in the way the children began calling the spare room ours, and in the way Elise began humming to herself again, soft and off-key when she thought no one was listening. The house hadn't changed, but it no longer echoed. It resonated, with presence, with breath, with something that looked an awful lot like family, if you squinted just right. The first snowfall came quietly, sometime before dawn. Jack woke to find the fields brushed white, a soft dusting over every flat surface like powdered sugar shaken over a long-forgotten table. The porch rails, the barn roof, even the old swing hanging from the oak tree wore a fine layer of stillness. It should have felt peaceful, but something felt off. Not wrong, just off. Like a room you once called home where the furniture had been moved just enough that your feet remembered the way it used to be. Jack shrugged into his coat and boots and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp, but the silence sharper. No birds, no wind. Just a quiet that pressed too close against the ears. And then he saw them. Footprints. Fresh. Not boot tracks from his own morning steps, but deep, longer than his, and coming from the edge of the property, right up to the fence line behind the barn. They didn't come from the road. They came from the woods. He followed them, each step crunching in the thin snow. The tracks veered close to the barn, paused, then doubled back, like whoever had made them had changed their mind at the last minute. When he reached the fence, he stopped. There, pressed between 2 slats of wood, was a torn piece of paper, folded, wedged deliberately. Jack hesitated, then pulled it free. The words were printed, blocky and uneven, but unmistakably threatening. "She doesn't belong to you." He read it twice, fingers tightening despite the cold. Inside the house, Elise was tying Noah's shoes while the girl, Lily, Jack had finally learned, worked on a paper snowflake with scissors and a tongue-out concentration that would have made any mother smile. Jack stood in the doorway, watching for a long moment before speaking. "Elise," he said quietly. She looked up, immediately alert. He nodded toward the back door. She followed him outside, pulling a sweater tighter around her. He handed her the note. As she read it, her face changed, not all at once, but in slow, painful stages. First confusion, then recognition. Then the kind of fear you don't scream about because screaming would make it real. She didn't speak. Just stared at the paper until her hands started to tremble. "He was here," she said finally, voice hoarse. Jack nodded. "Last night, from the woods. He found us." Not a question. Jack looked out at the tree line. "You think he's watching?" She hesitated. "He likes control. He won't act yet. Not until he's sure he can win." Jack's jaw tensed. "Then we make damn sure he can't." That afternoon, Jack called the sheriff. Walt, a man who'd fished beside Jack every summer for 15 years, and never once asked about the sadness in his eyes. Walt arrived in a cloud of gravel and exhaust, boots heavy, voice steady. Elise stayed inside while Jack explained. Walt read the note, exhaled through his nose, and nodded. "I'll put a patrol out this way." Quiet, no flashing lights, just eyes. Jack appreciated that. Walt knew what kind of eyes Elise was afraid of. "Anything you're not telling me?" Walt asked. Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "She's scared, Walt. That's all I need to know right now." Walt studied him, then clapped a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're a better man than you think." Jack didn't answer. That evening, as the snow deepened, Jack found Elise in the kitchen, her hands sunk into biscuit dough. Her sleeves were dusted in flour, her hair pinned up in a messy twist, and for a moment she looked like someone who had never run from anything, like someone who had always belonged in this kitchen. He wanted to keep it that way. She glanced at him. "They're asleep," she said. "Both of them. Exhausted." Jack nodded. Good. He didn't mention the shotgun he'd oiled that afternoon, or the back door he'd reinforced, or the alarm bell he'd rigged with a piece of twine and a rusted cowbell on the barn gate. She didn't ask. But she did pause, hands frozen mid-kneed. "I thought we were far enough," she whispered. Jack stepped closer, his voice low and certain. "You are, and you're not alone this time." She blinked hard. "I don't want you to get hurt." "I've been hurt," he said. "That part's done." They stood like that, between stove and table, between past and maybe. That night Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the window, the old rocker creaking beneath him, eyes scanning the tree line beyond the yard. The moon hung low, the snow glittering under its gaze. He thought about Elise's hands in flour, about the children's drawing still taped to the refrigerator, about the way this house no longer echoed, about what it meant to protect something, again, to choose it, even if it meant risking everything. At 3:14 a.m., the cowbell rang. Jack was already moving. The cowbell clanged once, then again. Then silence. Jack was already at the back door, boots half-laced, shotgun in hand. The wind outside had picked up, whipping across the field, pushing snow in low, angry gusts. The yard, blanketed in silver, looked like another world entirely. Quiet, pure, untouched, except for the footprints, fresh, deep, leading straight to the barn gate. He opened the door slowly, carefully, every sense honed. The cold bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. He'd felt worse, the kind of pain that doesn't bruise your skin but settles in your ribs and stays there. A figure moved beyond the fence. Jack stepped forward, slow and certain. "Stop where you are," he called. The man turned. Tall, lean, black coat, unshaven face that tried to smile but couldn't quite manage. Hands tucked into pockets like he had all the time in the world. "Easy," the man said. "Just out for a walk." "You don't walk through fences," Jack replied. "Wasn't locked. Now it is." The man tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You must be the farmer." Jack didn't answer. The man stepped forward, 1, 2 crunching steps in the snow. Jack raised the shotgun slightly enough to make it known he wasn't bluffing. Not another inch. "She here?" the man asked, voice low. Jack didn't blink. "You already know the answer to that." A grin. "Cold. Practiced. She's mine. Those kids are mine." "No," Jack said. "They were scared. They came here. Now they're safe. She doesn't get to decide that." "She already did." The man's eyes darkened. "You think this is gonna end well for you?" Jack stepped closer, calm and firm. "I've been through hell. You're not it." Silence. Then the man lunged. Jack didn't shoot. He stepped sideways, fast, slamming the butt of the shotgun into the man's shoulder, knocking him back into the snow. They both fell. The weapon clattered against the fence. Jack rolled to his feet first, panting, arms braced, prepared for another blow. But the man didn't get up. He stayed down, cradling his shoulder, spitting into the snow. Footsteps thundered behind them. Walt. Flashlight beam slicing the dark, 2 deputies behind him. "Hands where we can see them." Walt barked. The man didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared at Jack as they cuffed him. "I'll be back," he muttered. Jack's eyes didn't waver. "No," he said. "You won't." Back inside, the fire had gone low. Elise stood in the living room, arms around both children, still in pajamas, eyes wide and damp. The girl clutched the rabbit. The boy held his mother's sweater in his fist. Jack stepped inside slowly, breathing hard, snow still melting on his coat. "It's done," he said. Elise's knees buckled slightly. Jack caught her, steadying her by the shoulders. "Walt's taking him in. He'll face charges. You're not invisible anymore." She looked up at him, her whole body trembling. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "So was I." She shook her head. "I mean tonight, but also before, of trusting someone, of hoping again." I know. He reached out, gently, slowly, until his hand touched her cheek. I thought I was done feeling things, he said, voice breaking in the quiet. I thought whatever was soft in me had burned out with everything I lost. Her eyes flooded, breath hitched. But tonight, he whispered, when I saw him at the gate, when I thought about him taking you or them, I realized. She waited. I'd do it all again, Jack said. The fear, the pain, the risk. If it meant I could keep you safe. If it meant I didn't lose you too. A tear slipped down Elise's cheek. He wiped it gently with the back of his hand. You still think you're broken? She asked. Jack looked down at the children, then back to her. No, he said, but I do think I'm finally becoming whole. Later, when the kids were asleep and the fire had been rebuilt, they sat on the couch together. The storm had passed. Only soft snow fell now, brushing against the windows like a lullaby. Elise held Jack's hand. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His grip was enough. Strong. Still healing. Still here. The fire started just after midnight. It began in the far corner of the old barn, where the wood was dry, the roof sagged low, and no one would have noticed until it was too late. Jack had checked the locks, walked the fence, even unplugged the space heater in the shed. But some things he'd learned find a way in regardless. He woke to the smell, sharp, acidic, unmistakable. Smoke. Then came the light, orange against, the frost-glazed windows flickering too wildly to be morning. Jack was out of bed before his feet knew what they were doing. Elise met him in the hallway, robe half-tied, the children clinging to her legs. Stay inside, he said, voice rough with urgency. Jack, stay. He ran. The cold hit first, then the heat. The barn was already half gone, the flames, licking skyward, greedy and relentless. The crack of timber, the shatter of glass, the groan of things giving way filled the night like screams. But what hit him hardest wasn't the sound. It was the memory. This wasn't the first time he'd watched a home burn. 6 years earlier, it had been his daughter's bedroom. A faulty wire, a forgotten lamp, and a wall of flame that turned bedtime into a nightmare. Anna had gotten Maisie out, but the smoke had been faster than Jack. He still carried the scar. And the guilt. Tonight, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the garden hose, hopeless as it was, and aimed it at the flames. Water hissed uselessly against the blaze, steaming back into his face. Sparks flew, catching on the wind. He beat at them with a blanket. He called for Walt, for anything, for God. Nothing answered. Then a small voice behind him. Jack, he turned. Elise. The kids were safe inside, but she'd come out anyway, barefoot in the snow, eyes wide with something rawer than fear. We have to go, she cried. It's too late. Jack dropped the hose, his arms trembling, chest heaving. He looked at what remained of the barn. Flames twisting into the stars, casting shadows that looked too much like ghosts. And he let it go. He walked toward Elise, stumbling slightly, and she ran to him. There, in the yard where they had planted carrots last spring. She threw her arms around him and held tight. He collapsed into her, smoke still clinging to his clothes. And finally, she sobbed. Not quiet tears, not muffled pain, but full, unfiltered grief, the kind that had waited too long to speak. Jack didn't say anything. He just held her. Let her break. Let himself break too. Because in that moment there was no strength in being silent. No courage in pretending the loss didn't cut deep. The barn was gone. But they were not. An hour later, Walt stood in the ash with his flashlight sweeping over what was left. Looks deliberate, he said. Jack didn't speak. Walt clapped a hand. On his shoulder. I'll find out who. Jack looked toward the house. Elise stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, the children asleep on the couch behind her. The firelight flickered across her face, making her look like something eternal. Wounded. Yes, but still standing. I already know who, Jack said. Walt's jaw tightened. Want me to stay? Jack shook his head. No. He's gone. And he was. Jack knew it. Because this wasn't about scaring them anymore. It was about taking something back. But what he didn't know, what the man who lit the match didn't understand, was that the barn wasn't the heart of the farm. It wasn't where hope lived. The next morning, Jack found Elise in the kitchen, barefoot, hair damp, her hand wrapped around a chipped mug. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" "For bringing this here." Jack stepped forward, brushing ash from his coat. "You didn't bring the fire," he said. "You brought something worth protecting." Her eyes filled again. She turned away. Jack reached out, gently touched her back, just between the shoulder. "Blades, Elise," he said. She stopped. "I thought I couldn't love again. I thought that part of me had burned out too." She turned slowly. He met her eyes. "But last night, when I saw that fire, and I knew you were safe, I realized..." His voice caught, just for a second. "I'd already begun again. I just hadn't said it out loud." Her lip trembled. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." And then, like a door slowly creaking open in an old closed room, she stepped into his arms, laid her head against his chest, and didn't let go. Later, they stood in the backyard, the ground still warm beneath the ash. Elise held the children's hands. Jack held a sapling, a young tree in a burlap sack, thin and tender, but strong enough to survive what came next. They planted it together. No ceremony, no speeches, just fingers, in soil, breath in cold air, and a quiet promise that things could grow again. Even from ruins. Especially from ruins. The first to arrive was Marla from the bakery. She showed up just after sunrise, bundled in a thick coat with flowers still on her sleeves, a tray of warm scones in her hands. "I heard," she said, stepping into the yard, her voice catching. "And I figured no one thinks straight on an empty stomach." Jack blinked at her, caught off guard. He hadn't asked anyone to come. He hadn't planned to. Behind him, Elise stood with a blanket over her shoulders, one child in each arm. She didn't speak, but she nodded, just once, and Marla handed her the tray. An hour later came old Mason, the retired carpenter, with a sack of nails and a box of hand tools. "Thought you might need some spare hinges," he said, "and I still owe you for fixing that mower back in '08. Then came Ruth and Dennis from the diner, the sheriff's wife with 2 bags of groceries, and the Parker twins with their truck bed full of salvaged wood. By noon, the driveway was crowded with pickups and boots and the scent of cinnamon and sawdust. The backyard echoed with the ring of hammers, the scratch of shovels, the murmur of people who didn't need instructions, just purpose. Jack stood at the edge of it all, stunned. Silent. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was precise, steady, like Grace showing up in coveralls. They began with the barn's foundation. The ashes had cooled, and the air smelled faintly of charcoal and wet leaves. Mason directed the beams, Walt measured the posts, and a boy Jack barely knew climbed a ladder to tack down roofing felt with more care than most grown men. Elise brought out lemonade in a metal pitcher. Lily followed behind with paper cups. Noah stood beside Jack, quietly handing him nails one by one. "You okay?" Jack asked, crouching down to his level. Noah nodded. "It's loud." "Yeah," Jack said, smiling gently. "But it's a good kind of loud." The boy looked around, then back at him. "They all came." "They did. Why?" Jack looked toward the promise tree. Just a sapling now, the dirt still dark around its roots. "Because sometimes," he said, "when you plant something honest, people help it grow." By evening, the frame of the new barn stood proud against the fading sky. It wasn't finished. Not yet. But it was something. It had shape. Intention. And Jack knew that mattered more than perfection. Elise stood at the back step, her eyes wet, her children leaning into her hips. The sleeves of her sweater were dirty, her hair full of sawdust. She looked more at home than Jack had ever seen her. And when she met his gaze across the yard, across the lumber, the lanterns, the pieces coming together, he saw something there that he hadn't dared to name before. Belonging. That night after the trucks had gone and the sky was ink black and full of stars, Jack sat on the front porch with a blanket across his knees and Elise beside him. The kids had fallen asleep on the couch, curled together like roots wrapping tight beneath new earth. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. But after a while, Jack reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. She laced her fingers through his and rested her head on his shoulder. "It's not just us anymore," she whispered. "No," Jack said. "It never was." They sat in that quiet, soft, earned and glowing, as the wind rustled the branches of the sapling behind the house. And though it was too dark to see, they both knew. The tree was still standing, and it would grow. Because it had to, because now it wasn't just roots in the ground, it was a promise. Spring came later that year. The snow held longer than usual, as if unwilling to release its grip on the valley. But when it finally let go, it did so all at once, like the world had been waiting too. The fields behind the house turned green, again slow and stubborn. Shoots of wild grass pushed through last year's ash, and the sapling behind the barn, the promise tree, sprouted its first true leaves, small and bright and impossibly brave. Jack stood on the porch most mornings, coffee in hand, watching the sun break over the trees. The house no longer felt like a monument to what he'd lost. It felt like something entirely different now. It felt like it was breathing again. Inside, the walls held new sounds: laughter, mismatched footsteps, the hum of Elise singing while she swept the floor. There was always a half-finished drawing. On the fridge, a pair of socks on the stairs. A teacup left on the windowsill. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon more often than not. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. That Sunday, Jack sat beneath the oak in the far field, the same one where he'd first seen her, standing beside a stalled SUV in the rain. The memory came back like a photograph dipped in warm water. She had been frightened, but she had stood her ground. Now across the field, Elise walked toward him barefoot, the morning light in her hair, a picnic blanket under one arm, and Lily skipping at her side. Noah followed close behind, holding a carved wooden box Jack had made for his drawings. They reached him breathless. "We brought breakfast," Elise said. "I see that." Jack smiled, shifting to make room. They laid out the blanket, unwrapped sandwiches and apples and a jar of jam. Lily offered a dandelion crown she'd woven with stubby fingers. Jack bent his head so she could place it gently over his ball cap. "I declare you king," she said solemnly. He chuckled. "Of what?" "Of here," she said. "Of this field." After they'd eaten, the children wandered toward the edge of the grass, collecting wildflowers and secrets. Elise stayed beside Jack, their knees touching. She looked out over the land, then back at him. "I never asked," she said. "Why did you stop that day? Why me?" Jack took a breath, let it go slow. "Because you looked like someone who'd been told to keep going," he said. "But everything in you was asking to rest." Elise's eyes filled but didn't spill. "And because," he added softly, "I knew that feeling." She reached for his hand, warm and certain in hers. "I almost didn't knock on your door that night," she said. "I thought I'd already worn out my welcome in this world." Jack turned to her, his voice a low whisper. "You were the welcome." Later that evening, back at the house, the children bathed and asleep, the kitchen dim with the last of the day's light. Jack found Elise standing in the doorway of the nursery, the room they'd painted together in muted sage and soft white. Where the quilt Maisie had stitched now lay folded at the edge of the bed. She turned when she heard him. "I wrote something," she said, holding a piece of paper. "For the box?" She nodded. He waited as she crossed to the hearth and placed the letter gently inside the wooden box that had once held nothing but silence, and now held the story of something extraordinary. They stood there for a while, in the glow of the fire. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, "but I know what it feels like." Jack looked at her. "And what's that?" "Safe," chosen, home. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I don't believe in forever, he said. Not anymore. But I believe in mornings, in coffee, in taking turns with the dishes. I believe in building something, even if we have to do it with bare hands. She smiled, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. I don't need forever, she whispered. I just want someone who stays. I stay, Jack said, and then, gently, he kissed her. Not like a man claiming something, but like a man returning to something he hadn't known he'd lost. The next morning, Jack found a new letter on the hearth. It was written in a child's blocky handwriting, folded 3 times and held together with a drawing of a sun and a heart. He opened it. Dear Promise Tree, thank you for growing. We'll water you every day. Love, Lily and Noah. He placed it carefully in the box, then stepped out into the morning air, walked to the sapling, and knelt to press his hand into the earth. The soil was still cool, but something was taking root. Not just in the ground, in him. And if you had walked by the house that morning, if you'd seen the little tree swaying in the light wind, the soft smoke curling from the chimney, the way a man stood on the porch with one hand resting on the railing and the other tucked into someone else's, you wouldn't have seen a miracle, but you would have seen where one began, in a field, with a man who stopped, and a woman who stayed. Not every love begins with fireworks. Some start with silence, with shelter, with a choice to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. And maybe that's the kind of love we need more of. Not loud, not perfect, just present, just every day. If this story stayed with you, we invite you to stay with us too. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that heal, one heart, one home, one quiet miracle at a time.